Hello guys, do subscribe training programs, press the bell icon, never miss update.
To die. Churchill's response was, I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. It's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits. I mean, these are exact quotes, by the way, word for word. More people continue to die. The death toll started mounting. Ships laden with wheat from Australia were docking at Calcutta port, and the British officials wanted to disembark the wheat to save lives. Churchill said no, the ships would sail on to Europe for these buffer stocks, these reserve stocks. More people died. The figure kept mounting. It reached 4.3 million. When conscience-stricken British officials in Calcutta sent a memorandum to the Prime Minister in Downing Street about the consequences of his actions, that literally millions were dying, Churchill wrote on the margin of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British expect us to hail as some sort of apostle of freedom and democracy. As you can imagine, the very thought sticks in my craw. So that is the British record on famines. And there's more in the book, but I won't belabor too many points because I do want to leave time for an exchange with you. That's the best part of being in a university. But let me talk briefly about some of the arguments that are made for what the British did for India rather than to India. One example that is often cited is that India was unified because of the British, that there wouldn't be an India today except for British rule. First of all, the very premise is laughable because there had been an idea of India, Bharatvarsha, the land from the Himalayas to the oceans, going back to the Rig Veda, which is about 1500 BC, a good 3,000 years or more before the British got there. But what is more important was that successive Indian rulers had tried to consolidate the entire territory of today's India, and indeed more, including what's today Pakistan and Afghanistan, in their empires, and two had pretty much succeeded. The Maurya Empire under Chandragupta Maurya and Ashoka controlled about 90% of the entire subcontinent. In the 4th century and 3rd century before Christ. And the Mughals under Akbar and up to Aurangzeb in the 16th, 17th centuries controlled about 95% of the subcontinent at its peak. So the desire to control all of India as one preceded the British by a long chalk. Secondly, there was always a sense of civilizational unity in India well before the British. There was, for example, Adi Shankaracharya from my state of Kerala in the extreme south, traveling all the way to Kashmir in the north, to Dwarka in the west, to Puri in the east, and establishing his temples, his seats of religious learning, his mutts as they're called, and many, many other examples. The Harvard scholar Diana Eck writes of the sacred geography of India, knit together, she says, by countless tracks of pilgrimage. And if that seems a purely Hindu idea, let me mention that the Muslims felt the same way. Maulana Azad has written of how Indian Muslims going on the Hajj were received by and greeted by other Muslims, Arabs in particular, as all being from a common civilizational space. Whether they were Pathans from the northwest or Tamils from the southeast, these Indian Muslims were all called as Hindis, people from Al-Hind. So the world saw India as one before the British can claim credit for having knit it together. But what the British actually did was to divide it, because what they did was to essentially create the seeds of what became the destruction of this 3,000-year-old idea of India in a policy that was explicitly minuted. A wonderful thing, as I said, about British oppression is all these things are always written down. Lord Elphinstone, after seeing Hindu and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side and under each other's command, under the banner of the enfeebled Mughal monarch, against the foreign oppressor, in the so-called Mutiny of 1857, the Indian Revolt, he wrote a memo in 1858 saying, "Divide et impera" was the old Roman maxim, and it shall be ours. And of course, all of you good scholars in Edinburgh know it wasn't just a Roman maxim. It goes before the Romans to the Macedonians. It was Philip II of Macedon came up with, or Macedonia, who came up with the divide et impera phrase. But the British were the first to apply it in India, and they did it very systematically. Divide and rule became their ruling credo, and they decided that the basis of divide and rule must be religious, and there must be a conscious, deliberate attempt made to foment separate religious consciousness amongst the communities of India to prevent united opposition to them. And they did this systematically. They did it, as I've documented it in great detail in the book, sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through granting of favors, and sometimes through outright bribery. One of the more amusing episodes was how, when they partitioned Bengal in 1905 to create a Muslim-majority province in the eastern part of Bengal, the Muslim nobleman of Dhaka, Nawab of Dhaka, who was an Oxonian, absolutely refused and said, "Certainly not, this is a beastly idea, I shan't stand for it." So they slipped him £100,000 and he changed his tune. So that was the way in which these ideas were advanced. They went right through. When the British grudgingly granted very limited franchise in elections for a limited number of people to a limited number of seats in the Viceroy's Council and in provinces, so limited, in fact, that only 1 out of every 250 Indians had the vote. They still did so on the basis of separate, religiously separate communal electorates. While England would never have thought of, say, giving the Jews of Golders Green their own electoral list, in India, Muslims could only vote for Muslim candidates for seats reserved for Muslims. So this was a way of ensuring that people thought of their interests in religious grounds and thought of their political identity in religious grounds. So when the Indian National Congress, established in 1885, tried to represent all Indians, in fact, if you look at a list of their first 20-odd presidents, first 20 years, you'll find Christians, Parsis, Muslims, and Hindus all presiding over the Indian National Congress. And these were largely genteel Anglophile lawyers who were writing decorous petitions seeking the rights of Englishmen for the Indians. Nonetheless, what the British did was to actually set up and encourage the setting up of a rival body, the Muslim League, organized on religious lines, rather than co-opting the one body there was if they were serious about any notions of responsible self-government. I've been given the signal that it's time for me to begin to start wrapping up, so I won't go into the other examples until we get to our Q&A, but if any of you is interested in, for example, some of the other alleged benefits of British rule, and I will give one more. The fact is that in every single case, anything you can point to that India can claim as a benefit, it is without exception something brought into India in order to serve British interests, enhance British profits, or improve British control. No other purpose. There is not one thing that was actually given to India to benefit Indians. And I'm very happy to explain that in more detail when the time comes up. I'll give you one example which is too often cited to be left out of this talk, and that's the railways. One of the things I always find people falling back upon is, well, at least we gave them the railways. Well, yes, I mean, you couldn't really take all the tracks out of the ground, could you, and take them off. But anyway, the fact is that the railways were brought in explicitly for two purposes. One was to extract resources from the hinterland and ship them to the ports to take them off to England. And the second was to send troops into the interior to quell any popular unrest. But what's more striking is that even the building of the railways was a gigantic colonial scam. What happened was that the British guaranteed to investors in the Indian railways double the dividends, double the profits that they could make on any other British government investment at that time. In other words, you got double the rate of return on the highest returning British government securities. It was the most profitable thing you could invest money in between the 1840s and the 1870s was the Indian railways. So you got the British making big profits, and all the costs were paid for by Indian taxpayers without exception. It was described at the time as private profit at public risk, except that the private profit was all British and the public risk was all Indian. So lavishly did they spend on this, because they were making money out of it at every stage, that 1 mile of British railway at that time of British Indian railway, I beg your pardon, not in Britain, but India, cost 9 times what the same mile was costing at the same time in the US or Canada. That was how much how extortionate even the construction of the railways was. And as I've described in the book in greater detail than I have time for now, it was also run as a completely racist enterprise, right down to the fact that when passenger wagons were eventually added with wooden slats for benches for the Indians to sit and travel on, the Indian passengers paid the highest passenger rates of any railway in the world, whereas the British companies paid the lowest freight rates of any companies in the world, of any railways in the world, to ship their goods on these railways. It was only after independence that India reversed this pattern and made it now the cheapest form of railway travel in the world anywhere, though unfortunately also amongst the most expensive ways of shipping freight. But let me end by answering a question that many ask. What's the point of all this now? It's been 70 years, they're gone. What do you want out of this? And as I said, I'm not really looking for reparations. But I am looking for atonement. I think there is a moral debt that needs to be paid, far more than a financial one. And to my mind, that can take a couple of fairly obvious forms. The first is, as I say to my British friends, for God's sake, teach unvarnished colonial history in your schools. It is shocking that you can do A-levels in history in England today without learning a line of colonial history. The week my book came out in India, by coincidence, there was an article by a Pakistani journalist in The Guardian about raising two children, one of the best and most expensive public schools in London, who'd both done A-levels in history and hadn't heard a thing about colonial history. That's got to change. And I think that must really change in the interest of Britain as well. I recount, for example, a passage in the book about Horace Walpole taking a carriage down a London street and describing building after building that has been built by Indian money. He called London the sinkhole of Indian wealth. Nobody in London today has any idea that so much of London's, of the grand mansions, were built by money extracted from the colonies. You have undoubtedly the big concerns about the way in which history is remembered. All you've got now is either historical amnesia, no teaching of history, or, in the schools. I know you can study Indian history in universities if that's your subject, but obviously for a lot of people it won't be. But you don't actually learn all this there. And so there's no sense of the colonial connectivity. I remember being struck by a wonderful protest by a number of black and brown Britons objecting to all the anti-immigrant language in the political space a few years ago. And the photograph I saw in the newspapers was of these black and brown people holding up placards that read, in London this is, holding a placard saying, "We are here because you were there." And it's shocking, it was surprising to me that the Britons actually needed to be reminded of that. That is something that perhaps is worth talking about. The other thing worth talking about is the fact that in a country overflowing with museums, London is a capital littered with museums. One thieves' market after another. Every single thing practically in all these museums was purloined from some colony over the last few centuries. There's even an Imperial War Museum, but there is no museum to colonialism. There is nothing where a school child or a tourist or a visitor can go and see the whole story of what Britain did and gained from the various parts of the world it ruled. As I said in the Oxford debate, yes, the sun never set on the British Empire because even God couldn't trust the Englishman in the dark. But that's because they were there helping themselves to everything they could find in all these places around the world. And it would be good if a museum were constructed to show it. It'd be good if there were monuments. It's striking that in the heart of London there is a statue to the animals that fought with the Allies in the two world wars. But there is no statue to the Indian soldiers who fought in the two world wars. 1.3 million Indians fought in the First World War, 1.7 million in the Second World War. Over 150,000 Indians perished in defense of Britain's freedoms. And no statue. It's really quite remarkable, actually, when you think about it. I think in the First World War, more Victoria Crosses were won by Indians than by British soldiers. There were the famous Battle of Ypres, which stopped the German advance at the very beginning of the war when Britain was otherwise unprepared to resist the advance. Here you have Indian soldiers sailing to Egypt who were suddenly diverted onto Belgium because war had been declared and who were able to stop the German advance in Ypres and Neuve-Chapelle. You've got all these stories that are essentially unknown in Britain today. And I think, again, that needs to be told. But it's not just about remembering. The remembering is important. I'm always saying to young Indians, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? And I think that's true for British young people too. But it's something more, and that's perhaps the difficult part with which I'll conclude. I think that one essential form of atonement is an apology. Now, I know many Britons will say, but why should we apologize? We haven't done anything to the Indians. What's more, there's nobody really alive today who profited much from the British Raj or did anything to the Indians. And in any case, there's nobody alive in India today who directly, suffered at the point of a British bayonet or whatever. So why should we apologize? To which I will point to two counterexamples. First, the German Chancellor Willy Brandt sinking to his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto in the 1970s in apology for what the German Nazis had done to the Polish Jews. Now, Willy Brandt was a social democrat. People like him had been persecuted by the Nazis. He was completely innocent of any taint of Nazi wrongdoing. But he felt, as the embodiment of the German state, that it's never too late to do the right thing, that he needed to apologize on behalf of the German people. And the second example I would point to is from somebody you honored in this university just a year or two ago, Justin Trudeau. The Prime Minister of Canada apologized to the people of India in the Canadian Parliament for one incident, the so-called Komagata Maru incident, when a Japanese ship, the Komagata Maru, laden with Indian refugees fleeing British rule, was turned away at gunpoint from the port of Vancouver, and pretty much everybody on board later perished either on the high seas or at British hands when they landed. And that was not a direct crime in that Canada didn't actually kill people, but because they contributed indirectly to their deaths and they turned away asylum seekers, Trudeau felt it was right to apologize. That's something that Britain has never done. And I have the perfect occasion to suggest, because on the 13th of April 2019, you will have the centenary of the single worst atrocity of the British Raj in India. Not the worst in terms of numbers of people killed. The British killed some 100,000 people in Delhi alone in 1857-58 in putting down the so-called mutiny. But in terms of everything that happened around it, and I'll take 5 minutes just to tell you that story and I'll end and take your questions. What the British did was, as I said, India supported them in the First World War, and they said that they would accept this support, which, by the way, wasn't just the 1.3 million soldiers. It was vast sums of money from a starving country, money paid for not just by the treasuries of the Maharajas, but by poor Indian taxpayers at the time when the Spanish flu had taken a larger toll in India than any other country because our public health under British rule was in such bad shape. But India also supplied food, clothing, uniforms, carts, pack animals, and even rail lines ripped out of the ground to go and aid the war effort in Europe and Mesopotamia. And they did so because the British promised them responsible self-governance at the end of the war. And Indian leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, who called for support for the war effort, assumed this meant dominion status, which was what the so-called white Commonwealth countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa enjoyed at the time. Well, perfidious Albion broke its word, won the war, and didn't keep its promise. Not only no responsible self-government, but, in fact, Britain chose to reimpose the wartime era prohibitions on freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and so on. Whereupon protests immediately broke out across British India. The British responded by declaring martial law. They didn't use the word, but they sent British generals and soldiers to quell unrest throughout British India. And a man called Brigadier General Reginald Dyer showed up in the Punjab town of Amritsar to keep the peace there, declared that people could not assemble in groups of more than 5, but he didn't realize that he'd overlooked that this was the Punjabi spring festival of Baisakhi. And in fact, large numbers of people, both from Amritsar and from the surrounding villages, had gathered to commemorate Baisakhi in a walled garden, Jallianwala Bagh, with just one gate, one entrance to it. And these were men, women, and children, in fact, large numbers of women and children. There was song and dance and speechifying, and maybe some of the speeches were hostile to Britain, but there certainly wasn't a single weapon in sight. Daya heard these people had gathered. He marched there with his soldiers, didn't ask them why they were there, did not order them to disperse, did not even fire a warning shot. He just ordered his soldiers to assemble at the gate, the sole entrance and exit to the garden.